Hi everyone, it's a new day. So let's just get on with our chapter and finish it. So we're doing the reproduction in plants and we'll be doing these topics in this upcoming session that I have with you. And these topics will be the ones which will be very, very important for your exam as well. Also, these topics are a little bit detailed than what you have studied till now. So I implore you people to be a little more attentive in the class and note down everything that I say, okay? And don't you worry, we'll not be taking a boring class. We'll be watching a lot of videos as well for the sake of learning, of course. Anyway, so moving forward, we are learning about the pollination first. Everybody knows what pollination is. You have been studying about pollination for I don't know how long, okay? So let's just go by the keywords first and then we're going to watch a super cool video about it. All right? Okay, so when we are talking about the pollination, pollination is the transfer of pollen, that is the pollen grain from the male part. And that male part is we are talking about the stamen, right? Remember in the previous session, we learned about how a stamen contains a filament and an anther, and then anther is the one which produces all the kind of pollen grains, right? Now, see, from the male part, the stamen, the pollen grain is transferred to the female part of the plant, okay? And where it enters the female part of the plant, it is responsible for the fertilization, okay? And this entire thing of transfer of the pollen grain from the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant is called as the pollination, okay? Now you think that pollination is easy, right? Well, it is kind of easy, but then it is of multiple types. It could be done by the water, by wind, by animals, by birds, by insects. It could be done by multiple things, okay? And then there are two type of flowers, basically the flowers where the self pollination occurs and the flowers where the cross pollination occurs. Now for that to understand, you've got to know what is a pollination, self and cross, okay? So when we are talking about the pollination, we have the self pollination and we have the cross pollination. Now you should know then whenever we are talking about the self and cross pollination, we are talking about the unisexual and bisexual flowers, okay? Bisexual flowers are the ones which will have both the male and female reproductive parts, and unisexual flowers will be the one which will have the either male or female reproductive part, okay? So what really happens here in the self pollination, since on the same flower there is the male reproductive part and there's the female reproductive part, the pollen grain simply lands onto the stigma of the female reproductive part of the same plant, okay? Whereas in the cross pollination, the pollen grain of the plant or the flower, the male reproductive structure will have to travel to a longer distance for the sake of fertilization, okay? For the sake of fertilizing the female part of the another flower, okay? Now see, for this we require pollination the most, okay? This is still pretty easy, but then again there are multiple advantages and disadvantages, okay? If you're talking about the self pollination, let's say that self pollination is pretty good for the sake of being short of fertilization, being sure of producing the seeds, and being sure of everything. But at the same time, the cross pollination is so much better for the evolution. Although it does not ensure the fertilization, it does not ensure the formation of the seed, but cross pollination totally ensures that different genetic materials or the different DNA of the two plants are meeting, okay? And with the help of that, a new third type of DNA is created, which is responsible for better evolution and better survival. you know more the DNA is mixed, more we get new traits or new features, and more we try to adapt to the environment, and hence we have the more survival rate, right? Now that being said, we're going to watch a super cool video about what exactly is the pollination, okay? So here we are, let's just get on with it.
By now, we know how sexual reproduction in plants takes place. This is what we've learned. The flower, which is the reproductive organ of the plant, bears the male and the female parts. The male part, the stamen, contains the male gamete, while the female part, the pistil, has the female gamete. Fusion of the two gives rise to an embryo. Now let's get to know how exactly the process occurs. Let's learn about it in detail. But before that, tell me one thing. Do all flowers always possess both the floral parts together?
We just learned about it. Okay, do all the flowers have the all floral parts together? I think not, right? We just learned about the bisexual and unisexual flowers. Now just continue with it.
Some of them do. What do we call the types of flowers which possess both the male and the female floral parts together? Flowers which contain both stamen and pistil together are called bisexual flowers. Can you name a few examples of such types? Rose, China rose are a few in this category. What about other flowers then? Don't they contain both the male and the female floral parts together? Some flowers, such as those of gourd and pumpkin, possess either stamen or pistil.
They're talking about the bitter gourd, okay?
That is the reason why such flowers are called unisexual flowers. Now, getting back to the process, the first step is that of pollination. It is the process by which pollen grains are transferred to the female reproductive organs of a plant. In other words, pollen from the anther are transferred to the stigma. Does this process occur only between two flowers of the same type? Yes, that is correct. Pollination occurs between the flowers belonging to the same type. And does that mean pollination occurs only between two flowers born on the same plant? That question leads us to the types of pollination. The type in which pollination occurs between flowers born on the same plant is called as self-pollination. So what will the next type be? The other type of pollination is called cross-pollination, where the pollens travel from the anther to the stigma of a different flower on another plant. Can you guess how this process of transfer of pollen grains occurs? For this, there are several agents which aid the process. Agents such as wind and water are the abiotic ones. On the other hand, biotic pollinators such as bees, bats, moths, and birds also help in the process. The process of pollination makes sure that the pollen grain safely lands on the stigma. But what happens next? Does this lead to fertilization directly? Or are there any intermediate steps? We will answer all.
You know what? We will be answering that in the next slide. All right, now coming back to the point, we did talk about rose and China rose as the example of self-pollination, and we did talk about the bitter gourd as the cross-pollination. Now, the most important thing is how exactly are the plants or the wind and the water are doing this pollination, right? Let me give you a few examples of how exactly they're doing it. For example, if you're talking about the flowers which are pollinated by the wind and the water, which are the abiotic ones, they would not have any colors, and they would not have, I mean, they mostly do not have any colors, and they definitely do not have any kind of fragrance or the nectar. Okay, the flowers, which basically are the pollination subjects of the insects, they are the ones which has the colorful petals and they have a lot of nectar, so that insects are attracted towards them, which is quite opposite with the flowers which are pollinated by the abiotic factors such as the wind and the water. Okay, so please keep that in mind. And when we are talking about how exactly the pollen grain is being transferred, you know, pollen grain is a very very light, okay, and it's a little sticky as well. So when the insect enters, or let's say when an insect sits on a plant for the sake of nectar, so the pollen grains, they kind of stick, okay, to the body of that particular insect, and then insect transfers it to the another flower, not knowingly obviously. It just goes for more nectar to the next flower, and then it, you know, like it let's say wiggles a little bit and drinking the nectar and doing its own thing, and in the same process the pollen grain, it sticks to the stigma of the pistil that is there. Now that covers your pollination. Moving forward to the process of fertilization, everybody know what exactly what happens into the process of fertilization. We have the pollen grain, all right, and afterwards we have the egg which is present in the female part of the plant. Both match and they make zygote. Zygote is the one cell which is fused, which is basically the fused cell of the both pollen and egg. Okay, zygote is the cell which is produced after the fusion of the pollen and egg cell, and the fusion of egg and pollen cell is called as the fertilization, which leads to the formation of the zygote. On the other hand, this zygote, when it divides into the multiple cells, then it leads to the formation of the embryo. Okay, so don't get confused with that. Now, that being said, let's just get ahead with the definition here, and then we're going to watch another video so that you get a better understanding of whatever the process is. All right. So fertilization process, the union of male and female gametes. Union, basically the fusion is what we're talking about. And in the plants, pollination takes place, right? Because plants are incapable of moving from one place to the another, and there are four steps. There is fertilization, and there's four steps in the fertilization. There's pollination, which we studied about. There's germination, there's penetration into the ovule, and there's fertilization. Basically what happens is, first of all, the pollen grain is responsible for landing onto the stigma, and the germination that we're talking about here is the germination of pollen tube from the pollen grain into the stigma. Okay, so it's like this is the stigma. All right, this is the stigma, and if a pollen grain is going to land right on top of it, it's gonna make a pollen tube which goes into the ovules. Okay, ovules are the eggs which are situated right here, and this is called as the pollen tube, the red one that I'm talking about. Okay, and through this pollen tube, the polar nuclei, or let's say male nuclei, or the pollen nuclei, enter into the egg or the ovum. Okay, and then there's like penetration. Penetration is basically moving into the egg, moving into the ovule. That being said, then occurs the fertilization, which is the actual fusion of the male and the female gamete which is present in the egg. Okay, now that being said, we're gonna watch the video first. Okay, all right, here we are, let's get on with it.
Welcome to Wikipedia World Plants. Let's define what is fertilization. When a pollen grain lands on the surface of a stigma, it produces a tube. The increase of the tip of the tube contains the male cells of the flowers. These tubes grow down the style to reach the ovules in the ovary. Inside each ovule is an egg cell.
Okay, so what you've got to understand here is, what you see right here is the pollen grain. Okay, this is the pollen grain, and into the pollen grain, there are the pollen nuclei, okay, or the pollen male cells which are responsible for the sake of the fertilization. Now, what will happen here? The pollen tube will germinate. The yellow colored tube that you're seeing, this pollen tube is going to germinate. Okay, and when they germinate, they move towards the egg cell which is present in the ovary. Okay, so keep that in mind, and let's just move forward.
Fertilization in flowering plants was discovered by Strasburger in 1884.
I mean, this name is pretty easy to remember, right? Strauss Burger. Okay, go ahead.
So how fertilization in plant takes place? As you can see in the image, first, the pollen grain germinates after the carpel is pollinated.
Another name of pistil is carpel.
From the germinated pollen grain, a pollen tube emerges and grows. It travels and grows and moves toward the ovary by creating a path through the female tissue. And we have two types of nucleus. The first one, we have the vegetative tube, and the second one, we have generative nuclei of the pollen grain pass into the pollen tube. The stigma secretes a sugary substance that stimulates the growth of the pollen tube.
Okay, let me just clear this a bit. When we are talking about the stigma secreting a sugary substance, you can do this at your home as well if you have a microscope, that is, or you can do it in your school or request your teacher for doing it. What you can do basically is you can collect the pollen grains of a flower which is easily available in all the schools, which is the China rose or the hibiscus plant. Okay, so yellow colored pollen grains are the ones which you can dust into a sucrose solution or a sugar solution, and after leaving it for like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, let's say 1 hour. 1 hour is like the maximum limit. You can take out those pollen grains and you can observe them under the microscope. What you'll see is that there's a growth of the pollen tube. Now when we are talking about the pollen tube will secrete at least two pollen nuclei. One will be vegetative, another will be generative. Vegetative is responsible for the sake of making up of the entire food storage for the growing zygote or the growing embryo, and the generative one is supposed to form the zygote after the fusion with the egg cell. Okay, so do not get confused about it, or you can watch the recording again, or you can watch the video which is attached to this particular video. Okay.
The pollen contains the vegetative and the generative nucleus, and the cell ruptures the stigma and passes through the style. The pollen grains attaches itself to the stigma of the female reproductive structure. The pollen tube grows and enters the ovule, making a tiny pore called micropyle.
Okay, now the important thing here is whenever there is the penetration of the pollen tube into the ovary and an egg or the ovule, the pore through which the entire pollen tube penetrates or enters into the egg is called as the micropyle. Okay.
The pollen tube does not reach the ovary in a straight line. The pollen tube grows near the style and curls to the bottom of the ovary and then near the receptacle. The pollen tube then breaks into the ovule through the micropyle, and then the micropyle bursts into the embryo sac. In the embryo sac, on the male nucleus fuses with the nucleus of the egg and forms a diploid cycle, and this become.
Don't you worry about it. I'll explain each and everything with the help of a diagram. Now, let me see if we fast forward this video, if we can get the diagram. Okay, hold up.
Fusion, where translation in both female tissue.
Don't you worry about it. Let me get to a diagram and then we can go ahead with it. Okay. All right, now since we have gotten to this particular diagram, the important part is this particular diagram itself. Okay, you don't have to do it after this diagram. So this much is all right. So what you see right here is you see that just follow the mouse, everybody. Okay, so you see pollination happened, and from the like onto the pistil, there was the landing of the anther, like the landing of the pollen grain from the anther, and when that happened, the growth of pollen tube occurred, and when the growth of the pollen tube occurred, it entered into the ovarian egg through the pore which is called as the micropyle. Just follow the mouse, white colored mouse, you can see it right here, the white colored mouse. Okay, it is present right here where the micropyle would be present, which is the pore through which the pollen tube enters. Now the pollen tube never goes straight. Okay, it has to go like this, it has to go into a sigmoid fashion, in a sigmoid fashion. Okay, so what really happens, what you see right here is an egg cell, or let's say you see an embryo sac. Embryo sac will have multiple cells into it, and it'll have an egg cell, and it'll have multiple different structures. Okay, I'll draw the diagram for you, it'll make it easier. Now what really happens is there are multiple type of ovules as well, which you do not need to study right now. Okay, so I'll be moving forward to the next part of the video or the chapter. Everyone, and now coming back to the main topic that there is, this is the double fertilization in the plant. I'll be talking that I was talking about how there are two different type of male nuclei which are generated and which travel through the pollen tube. There's the generative one, there's vegetative one. Okay, now do one thing, you follow the mouse please. When you see the mouse, what you see right here is the micropyle end through which the pollen tube is entering. All right, and when you see this, you do realize that there are, when you enter into the egg cell or when you enter into into the embryo sac, what you see right here is that there are two synergid cells. Okay, the two orange colored cells that you see are the synergid cells. There is no particular function, they just help in the guidance of the micropyle into the embryo sac. And then we have the egg cell. Egg cell is very, very important because with this one, the generative nucleus is going to fuse and make the zygote. And then we have the antipodals. Antipodals are present opposite to the micropylar end, and these also degenerate after the fertilizations. They do not have any particular function. And then we have the polar nuclei. There are two polar nuclei which are present in the center of the embryo sac, with which the vegetative polar nuclei is going to fuse and form the food reserve material for the sake of growth of embryo or the zygote, which is formed when the egg fuses with the generative nucleus. Okay, now moving forward with the video.
As you can see in the image, this is the double fertilization in plant. The pollen grain adheres to the stigma, which contains two cells, generative and the tube cell. The pollen tube cells grows into the style. The generative cells travels inside the pollen tube and it divides to form two sperm. The pollen tube penetrates an opening in the ovule called micropate.
Okay, the sperm cells is what she's calling the vegetative and generative pollen nucleus or the male gamete. Okay, do not get confused about it. It is super easy.
And in embryo sac, one of the sperm fertilize the egg to form the diploid zygote, and the other sperm fertilize two polar nuclei to form the triploid endosperm, and which become a food source for the growing embryo.
Now we'll do one thing. I will summarize the entire thing for you. When we are talking about the double fertilization of the plant or the fertilization part of the plant, we are talking about the two pollen nuclei or the two sperm cells which enter into the ovary after the pollen tube is generated. Then this pollen tube is going to enter into the embryo sac through the end, which is called as the micropyle, or through a pore which is called as the micropyle. Now when that happens, one generative sperm cell fuses with the egg cell, forms the zygote, which is diploid. Diploid means it will have two sets of the chromosomes. Okay, that means it will have the complete DNA. And then another, which is the vegetative nuclei, vegetative sperm cell, it goes and fuses with the polar nuclei, which are present in the center of the embryo sac, the purple colored diagram, the purple colored structure that you see onto which the mouse is there. Okay, which forms the triploid endosperm. Okay, triploid means it will be three nucleus which are fusing. Okay, so it will have three sets of the chromosomes. That is why it is called as the triploid triploid nucleus. Okay, now this is called as the endosperm. Why is it called as the endosperm? The major function of the endosperm is to become the source of growth or the source of food for the growing embryo. Got my point? All right, now that we have studied enough about the process of fertilization and the process of double fertilization, don't you get confused. It is super easy. You can come back here in this particular session recording and revise it anytime you want. Okay, now moving forward to the next topic of the day, we have the fruits and seed formation. Now the fruit and seed formation, this ovary, see, ovary stores the food, which is quite obvious. Okay, so the fruit formation is after there is the fertilization, after there is the happening of the formation of zygote and the embryo, the ovule is going to become the seed. Okay, but the ovary is going to become a fruit. Okay, so after the ovary grows into the size after the fertilization, and it stores a lot of food, and then it transforms into the fruit. Okay, which is very important. But then on the other hand, all of this happens with the help of the different hormones. Now, do not get confused. Even the plants secrete the hormones. We have the auxins, like not wavy, but plants have the auxins, which are secreted by the ovary, and the ovary's wall transforms into the pericarp. Now, see, when we are talking about the fruit will have about multiple layers. The outer layer is called as the pericarp. Okay, the middle layer, or let's say the internal layer, is called as the endocarp. The internal layer is called as the endocarp, and the middle layer is called as the mesocarp. Okay, endocarp is the one which could be a little tough, it could be a little soft, depending upon the type of plant that or the fruit that we're eating. Okay, now see, it is very important for you to understand that the fruits are of two types. There are the true fruits and there are the false fruit. The fruits which are formed with the help of the ovary, or the fruits which are formed because of the ovary, those are the ones which are called as the true fruits. Okay, but the fruits which are formed with any other part of the flower rather than ovary are called as the false fruit. Okay, for example, apple. Okay, apple is formed with the receptacle, or let's say thalamus, which is there. All right, now that being said, we have the seed formation. Seed formation is, you see, the synergid cell, antipodal cells, they decay or degenerate. Remember when I was just telling you about the ovule, the structure of the ovule, how it will have the three antipodal cells, and then it will have the two synergid cells, and one egg cell is present right here, and the two polar nuclei are present right here. So the antipodal and synergid cell are going to degenerate or decay whatsoever, and micropyle, it just remains. Okay, and then ovule wall becomes the seed coat, which is very, very important. Okay, and after then, seed coat formation is very important for the sake of protection of the embryo or the zygote which is formed. Okay, I hope that is clear to all of you. Next is the seed dispersal. It is very important. It's like unsaid thing. Okay, when there is the formation of the fruit, there's got to be the seed formation, and after that, that seed needs to travel to far off places so that the species of that particular plant can remain alive and can spread throughout the area. So seed dispersal is basically the movement or the spread or the transport of the seeds away from the parent plant. Okay, because the plants have the limited mobility, because the plants cannot move. There are different vectors, or there are different let's say organisms as well, which help in the seed dispersal. Again, it is also divided into two types. It is the biotic, which is the living organisms, and it is the abiotic, which is the non-living organism through which the seed dispersal occurs. Okay, so we're gonna do one thing. We're gonna watch a video over it. All right, now let's just start with the seed dispersal. Okay.
Previous video, we learned the fertilization process and what it leads to. The process helps in the formation of fruits and seeds enclosed in them. The seeds are the structures containing the embryo within. Now, all that's required is proper rooting of the seeds in the soil. This will result in germination and thus growth of a new plant. But now the question arises, how are these seeds fixed in the soil? Do they always get rooted near the parent plant from where they arise? Or sometimes at distances as well? Seeds can be dispersed to nearby or distant places as well, all thanks to the process of seed dispersal. The process by which seeds are dispersed to distant places by various agents is known as dispersal of seeds. Who are these agents? Seeds are transferred to various places by factors such as the wind, water, explosion, and animals. These agents make the process of dispersal of seeds easier. Let's now discuss about this process in detail. Our first agent of dispersal is the wind. Seeds of plants like dandelions have parachute-like or hair-like structures attached that are so light in weight that they easily get carried away by the wind. Thus, even the seeds get carried to distant places. What is the next agent we have in our list? It's water. Fruits which float, such as those of the lotus and coconut palm, are carried by water. You won't believe that coconuts can travel for thousands of kilometers across seas and oceans. Hard to believe, but they do. What is the next type of dispersal? Let me name it for you. It's called the dispersal by explosion. Did I just say explosion? You heard me right. Then what exactly explodes in a plant? In some cases, fruits or pods containing seeds burst on their own. The pods dry and split open suddenly with considerable force, which throws the seed at a distance. What are the examples of such type? We have plants like broom and peas, which belong to this category. Now, these were all the abiotic agents. Last in the list are the biotic agents, which we need to have a look at. Biotic means living organisms. So, are animals also responsible for dispersal of seeds? Yes, they are. Tell me one thing. What do we do with the seeds after eating juicy fruits? We generally throw away the seeds, right? Yes, that is how seeds from a plant growing in one area reach a completely different area. Plants are even benefited with the seed dispersal by animals. To understand this, let's take the simple example of birds. Birds also relish on the juicy fruits that have seeds within. In many cases, the seeds of the plants are too tough to germinate if planted directly into the soil. Now, if such a fruit is consumed by a bird, then the seed does not get digested in the bird's body and is thrown away directly. However, the hard seed cover softens a bit due to the chemical activity of the acids present in the bird's stomach. So, as the seed passes through the bird's gut, it gets soft, and when it drops on the ground and gets rooted, it becomes easy for the seed to germinate. This is how animals can help in far and wide dispersal of seeds. Can you name some seeds which belong to this category? Blackberry, cherry, apple, and so many pulpy fruits have seeds that are dispersed by animals. Now tell me, why do we need this dispersal process? I mean, what will happen if the seeds from the parent plant get planted near it? Being near the parent plant would severely affect the growth and development of both the plants. And why so? The two will start competing for sunlight and water. That is the reason why seed dispersal is extremely useful for plants.
I really hope that everything's clear, okay? Now that we have studied and completed the chapter, we're going to move forward to a few questions, okay? Now see, the ovaries of different plants may contain one ovule, many ovules, one to many ovules, or only two ovules. Yes, you're absolutely correct. The answer is C, okay? One to many ovules, completely dependent upon the type of plant that we're talking about. Next question is, pollination refers to transfer of pollen from anther to ovary, transfer of male gamete from anther to stigma, transfer of pollen from anther to stigma, and transfer of pollen from anther to ovule. Yes, you're absolutely correct. It is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma. This is what we learned about, okay? And that's it all for today. I'm so very happy that we finished this particular chapter. So yay for us, okay? And that's all for today. I'm gonna see you in the next chapter, maybe. You guys take care, have fun, stay safe, and learn a lot. Bye-bye.